The grand mansion stood eerily silent, its vast halls heavy with the weight of secrets too dark to be spoken. Sharon sat alone in the extravagant living room, though she had never felt more imprisoned. The chandeliers sparkled above her, reflecting off the polished marble floors, yet the beauty of her surroundings did nothing to lift the suffocating weight pressing against her chest. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in, whispering accusations in the dead of night, reminding her of the lives lost in the pursuit of fortune. She wrapped her arms around herself, her fingers digging into the soft fabric of her silk robe. It was supposed to bring her comfort, yet it felt like a shroud, a veil masking the rot beneath. The memories clawed at her mind, her son's lifeless body, Paul's descent into damnation, the deal that had been struck before she even knew what she had become a part of. The ghosts of her past loomed over her, their presence as tangible as the air she breathed. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone. She didn't need to think twice. She already knew the number by heart. There was only one call to make. With each ring, her breath hitched, her pulse hammering beneath her skin. Then, a voice slithered through the receiver, smooth as silk and laced with poison. "I assume you've come to your senses, dear Sharon," Moros purred, his amusement evident. Sharon swallowed hard, her throat dry, her voice barely a whisper. "I'll do it. I'll take over Paul's duties." The laughter that followed was low and cruel, sliding over her skin like oil on water. "I knew you would," Moros said, his voice filled with satisfaction. "You've seen what happens when you resist." Before she could speak, before she could even take a breath, the air in the room shifted. The lights dimmed without warning, and the temperature dropped. The shadows stretched unnaturally, thickening, deepening. And then, he was there. Moros stood before her, his arrival silent yet suffocating. He was dressed impeccably, as always, his suit crisp, his expression one of twisted delight. His presence carried an unnatural power, something ancient, something that should not exist in the realm of the living. His sharp eyes glowed faintly, drinking in her submission. Sharon felt her stomach churn, bile rising in her throat, but she held herself together as he reached into his coat and withdrew a parchment. The contract was deep red, soaked in something darker than ink. A dagger lay beside it, its blade impossibly sharp, waiting. "Sign," Moros commanded, his voice smooth yet absolute. "Your husband did, and now you must." Sharon hesitated, but she knew there was no way out. This was her fate. Slowly she reached for the dagger. The metal was icy against her skin, yet when she pressed it against her palm, it burned as if alive. With a wince, she dragged the blade across her flesh, watching as her own blood dripped onto the parchment. The second the drop touched the page, the contract glowed faintly, and Moros let out a pleased sigh. "The covenant is sealed," he whispered, his lips curling into a triumphant smile. "A life of wealth, a soul of rot." The moment the contract was signed, Sharon's life transformed. No longer was she simply the widow of Paul, the man who had made the original pact. Now, she was the queen of the cursed empire he had built. From the outside, her life seemed perfect. She was adored, revered, and envied by many. The world saw a woman of grace and power, a widow draped in wealth, untouched by sorrow. They whispered about her fortune, about her elegance, about how she carried herself with an air of mystery and refinement. But what no one saw was the truth. Behind the closed doors of the mansion, Sharon was a prisoner. She continued the rituals Paul had once performed, her hands forever stained with the lives she took to keep the wealth flowing. She had long since lost count of how many sacrifices had been made in the red room beneath her feet. At night, she lay beneath silk sheets, but sleep never came. The whispers were always there, the voices of those whose blood had been spilled for her riches. Sometimes she saw them in the corners of her vision, their hollow eyes filled with pain, their lips moving in silent curses. Every morning she woke before the sun, sitting at her vanity, painting her face, dressing in the finest gowns, preparing herself for the public eye. But no amount of powder could hide the emptiness in her eyes. No luxury could fill the void in her chest. Her daughters grew into beautiful women, basking in the wealth they had been born into. They wore diamonds and designer gowns, their lives untouched by struggle, their world one of privilege and perfection. Yet they were blind to the truth that lurked beneath their feet, oblivious to the sacrifices that had paved the way for their comfort. They never questioned why their mother refused to enter certain rooms, why she locked her doors at night, or why she sat alone in the dark for hours, staring at nothing. But Sharon knew. She knew the mansion was not just built on wealth, it was built on curses and cadavers. She knew that one day the spirits would come for her daughters, just as they had come for Paul, just as they had come for her son. That thought alone, the idea of her children bearing the weight of her sins, was more unbearable than death itself. So she did the only thing that made sense. She sent Matthew away. It was the only way to keep him safe. She could already see it in his eyes. He was different. He did not belong to this world of blood and darkness. He had not been tainted by the wealth that had consumed her and his father. He still had a chance. The night before she sent him away, she stood outside his room, listening to his soft breathing. He was just a boy, innocent, untouched by the horrors of their family's legacy. She placed a trembling hand on the doorframe, closing her eyes as she made her decision. The next morning, she packed his bags and sent him to her mother. She told him it was for the best, that he would be happier there, but she did not tell him the truth. She did not tell him that he was her last hope, that he was the only thing standing between their bloodline and the curse that threatened to consume them all. She watched him go, standing at the grand entrance of the mansion, her hands clasped tightly as he disappeared down the long driveway. And as the car carrying her son vanished into the distance, she whispered under her breath, "Forgive me." Then she turned back into the house, back into the prison she had built for herself. Her fate was sealed. But maybe, just maybe, Matthew's was not.